The morning sun filtered through the cream-colored curtains, casting long, soft stripes across the polished wooden floor of the Harper home. Emily Harper, 8 months pregnant, moved slowly across the kitchen, cradling her belly as she filled the kettle with water. The hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock were the only sounds, a deceptive calmness that filled the otherwise immaculate space. Emily's eyes lingered on the small photo frame on the counter, her and Mark smiling on a weekend getaway, their hands entwined, faces radiant. A shadow of unease crossed her features, though. Something had felt off ever since Margaret arrived yesterday afternoon. Max, the golden retriever, padded silently behind her, his ears flicking at every faint creak of the old house. Normally gentle and playful, he now stayed close to Emily's side, his tail low, a growl rumbling softly in his throat. Emily reached down, stroking his fur, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, Max," she. But the dog didn't seem convinced, and neither was she. The front door opened, and Mark stepped in, briefcase in hand, his crisp suit slightly rumpled from the drive. "Morning, love," he said, planting a kiss on her forehead. His eyes were tired but kind, the way they always were in the early mornings before the day's responsibilities took over. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired, a little anxious, I guess. Margaret's been—" She stopped, unsure how to voice her unease without sounding irrational. Mark glanced toward the empty living room. "She's just helping around. Don't let it get to you." His tone was calm, almost dismissive, but there was a subtle edge beneath it. He always tried to smooth over family tension, but Emily knew better. Margaret Harper appeared in the doorway, holding a tray with a steaming cup of tea. She was dressed neatly, hair perfectly coiffed, but her sharp gaze never left Emily. "I thought you might need a little boost this morning." "Morning," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, like a knife sliding across silk. Emily accepted the cup, hands trembling slightly. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes, and the tiny crease between her brows suggested a judgment Emily couldn't shake. As Emily sipped the tea, she noticed Max staring at Margaret, stiff and alert. He barked once, short and insistent, then sat down, tail wagging hesitantly, as though unsure what he had just seen. Margaret's lips pressed together in a thin line, and Emily's heart began to race. The domestic tranquility she had clung to felt fragile, ready to shatter. Mark cleared his throat. "We're going to pick up a few things from the store later, just a short run." He smiled at Emily, but it didn't reach his eyes either. "Nothing to worry about." Emily nodded, forcing a smile, though a knot of apprehension had settled in her chest. After breakfast, Emily moved to the living room to settle into the armchair by the window, wrapping a soft blanket around her legs. The sunlight fell on her face, highlighting the faint worry lines that had grown deeper over the past few weeks. Max curled at her feet, alert and restless, his gaze flicking between the door and Margaret. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed magnified. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just nerves, just pregnancy fatigue. But she couldn't ignore the way the air had shifted since Margaret arrived, the way Max reacted, the quiet intensity in Mark's eyes when he looked at her. Something was coming, something Emily couldn't yet name, and she had the strangest, most terrible feeling that when it arrived, nothing would be the same again. The afternoon sunlight slanted across the Harper living room, warm yet heavy, casting long shadows along the walls. Emily sat in her armchair, Max lying at her feet, his head resting on her ankle. She tried to read a magazine, but her eyes skimmed the pages without really seeing them. Every sound in the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant whir of the ceiling fan, even the creak of the floorboards, felt amplified, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Margaret moved through the kitchen, humming softly, her presence oddly intrusive. She washed dishes with slow, deliberate movements, glancing occasionally toward Emily. Each glance felt like a probe, measuring, judging. Emily forced herself to look away, to focus on the magazine, but the tension coiled tighter in her stomach. Max's ears twitched. A low growl rumbled in his throat, almost imperceptible at first. Emily noticed his fur along the back of his neck bristle. "Max?" she whispered, trying to calm him. The dog's gaze was locked on Margaret, unblinking, sharp and wary. Emily followed his line of sight, and her heart skipped. Margaret was standing perfectly still now, hands clasped in front of her, watching Emily with that same thin, unreadable smile. A sudden bark shattered the quiet, short and insistent. Max leaped to his feet, his nails clicking against the hardwood, and barked again, louder this time. Margaret flinched almost imperceptibly, and Emily's pulse raced. The dog's warning was clear, and though she didn't understand why, an icy shiver ran down her spine. Mark appeared in the doorway, briefcase in hand, his eyes narrowing slightly at the noise. "Max, calm down," he said firmly, his voice carrying authority. Max paused, still alert, but didn't sit. Emily noticed Mark glance at Margaret, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, though he said nothing. Emily forced a small laugh, trying to mask her anxiety. "He's probably just sensing something," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. She didn't add what she had been thinking. The strange way Max reacted had a weight to it she couldn't explain, a warning she felt in her bones. Margaret returned to the dishes, her movements precise, controlled, but there was a tension in her shoulders now, subtle but undeniable. Emily's gaze lingered on her mother-in-law, heart thudding, mind racing through every possibility of why Max had reacted so violently. Margaret's smile never wavered, yet there was something in her eyes, calculating, cold, that Emily had only glimpsed once before, in passing, during an argument over trivial matters that now seemed irrelevant. Max barked again, sharper this time, the sound echoing in the quiet house. Emily rose slowly, instinctively stepping toward him. Her hand rested on his back, trying to ground herself, to calm the rising panic. The dog's eyes, wide and fixed, followed Margaret as she moved toward the living room, brushing past the doorway with unnerving precision. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood on end. She realized, with a sudden, sickening certainty, that the warning was not about a small annoyance or a fleeting quarrel. Max's agitation, the cold tension in Margaret's presence, the unspoken weight in Mark's brief glance. They were pieces of a puzzle Emily wasn't ready to see. The day's quiet, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Shadows stretched longer across the walls as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Emily sank back into her chair, gripping Max's fur tightly. She whispered, almost to herself, "Something's coming. I just don't know what yet." And in that moment, Max's growl deepened, a low rumble that seemed to echo the unspoken threat lingering in the house. The evening sky bled shades of amber and gray through the living room window as Emily sank deeper into the armchair, Max curled tightly at her feet. The dog's restless movements earlier in the day had left a lingering unease in her chest, a tension she couldn't shake. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now, pressing against the fragile calm of the house. Mark appeared from the hallway, loosening his tie. "Long day," he said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Emily returned a faint one, though it faltered as her mind traced the events of the afternoon. Margaret had stayed in the kitchen for hours, her gaze following Emily like a silent accusation. Every word from her carefully measured, every movement deliberate. The thought made Emily's stomach tighten, far beyond what her pregnancy should have caused. "Do you want some tea?" Mark asked, picking up a cup from the counter. Emily nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As he prepared the cups, she watched Margaret settle into the armchair across the room. Her posture was rigid, her smile small and controlled, like a mask carefully sculpted for appearances. Emily felt a twinge of resentment, tempered by caution. She had learned early that confronting Margaret rarely yielded clarity. More often, it opened doors to subtle humiliation or veiled criticism. Max's ears twitched again, his head lifting briefly before resting back on Emily's ankle. The dog's unspoken warning echoed in her mind. She tried to push the unease aside, focusing instead on her best friend, Clara. Emily had called her earlier, confiding quietly about Margaret's overbearing presence and the strange tension in the house. Clara's voice, warm and familiar, had provided a brief reprieve from her growing dread. "Something about her makes the air feel heavy," Emily had said into the phone. Clara had sighed. "You've always been sensitive to people like that," she said. "Just be careful, Emily. Don't let her get under your skin too much." Those words replayed now, sharper than they had during the call, each one a reminder that she was not imagining the unease creeping into her life. Mark returned, setting the steaming cups on the table. He sat beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I know it's uncomfortable," he said softly, "but try not to let it get to you. She's family. She's just particular." Emily nodded, forcing another smile. The fractured warmth in her chest refused to settle. It was not just discomfort, it was a warning, a deep instinct that something in the household was off balance and not easily corrected. Margaret spoke suddenly, her voice light yet edged with a subtle, unidentifiable sharpness. "You should rest, Emily. You'll need your strength soon." Her words, polite on the surface, carried the weight of judgment beneath, and Emily felt a chill creep through her. She nodded silently, gripping her tea tightly as though it could anchor her to safety. Max growled softly, low and insistent, and Emily stiffened. The dog's instincts were clearer than anything else, the warning unspoken but undeniable. Minutes stretched like hours as the three sat in the room, a fragile peace built on tension rather than comfort. Emily sipped her tea slowly, careful not to let her hand shake, her gaze flicking constantly between Mark and Margaret. Every smile, every small gesture seemed fractured, layered with hidden meanings and unspoken accusations. The home that had once felt safe now felt like a cage, the walls closing in. By the time Mark cleared the cups and suggested Emily rest, the shadows had deepened, and the house seemed colder than before. Max lifted his head, ears pricked, his eyes meeting hers, as if to confirm the thought Emily had tried to ignore all evening. The storm had already begun. And Emily knew, with a clarity that chilled her, that tonight would not pass quietly. Something within the walls, something hidden in plain sight, had shifted, and the fracture she sensed in every smile around her was only the beginning. The house was quieter than usual that evening, a heavy stillness that pressed against Emily's chest. Shadows stretched across the walls as the last rays of sunlight fell through the blinds. She sat on the edge of the sofa, phone in hand, scrolling through her contacts, hoping to hear a familiar voice that might anchor her. Mark had stepped into the study to finalize some work, leaving Emily alone with Max, who rested uneasily at her feet. She dialed Clara's number for the third time that day. Each ring seemed to stretch longer, echoing against the walls. The voicemail picked up again, leaving only the hollow beep. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she hung up. Something felt wrong. Not Clara's fault, not even Mark's, but a gnawing sense of isolation that tightened in her chest. Max shifted his position, ears twitching, and let out a soft growl that made Emily glance toward the hallway. Empty, silent, too silent. A low creak made her turn sharply. Margaret had moved from the kitchen into the living room, her expression unreadable. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice honeyed, but carrying an edge that made Emily's stomach knot. She nodded quickly, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Yes, just wanted to call Clara." Margaret's gaze lingered a beat too long, and Emily felt exposed, watched. The soft thud of Max's paws on the floor reminded her that the dog was uneasy too, sensing a tension that she could not yet name. "You should rest," Margaret said, stepping closer. "These last weeks are exhausting for you." Her words were outwardly kind, but Emily felt the subtle pressure beneath them, the judgment masked as concern. Emily set the phone aside and rose to fetch a blanket. She walked slowly, each step heavy, every creak of the floor amplifying her sense of vulnerability. Max followed closely, head low, growling softly at the shadowed corners of the room. She wrapped herself in the blanket, sitting back down on the sofa, and tried to steady her breathing. But even as she focused on the rhythm, the anxiety remained, a persistent hum beneath her skin. She glanced at the clock. Mark had been gone longer than usual. Normally, he returned quickly after checking emails or handling a call. A flicker of worry passed over her mind. The phone buzzed lightly, and Emily jumped, hoping it was Clara finally returning the call. But it was only a routine notification from the weather app. A sigh escaped her lips. Margaret moved again, closer this time, settling in the armchair opposite her. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Emily felt the air change, heavy with unspoken words. The subtle sharpness in Margaret's gaze seemed to sharpen further, as though she could see into Emily's anxious thoughts and dissect them one by one. Max barked suddenly, a short, insistent sound, making Emily jump again. He ran to the hallway and barked repeatedly, stopping only when Margaret remained still, unflinching, her eyes locked on him like a predator, unbothered by the warning. Emily's hands gripped the blanket tighter. The protective comfort of Max at her side now seemed fragile, a thin shield against an invisible threat. She thought about calling Mark again, but hesitation rooted her in place. Something in the house had shifted, something that neither Max's growls nor her instincts could fully explain. Then it hit her, an empty, sinking feeling. Mark hadn't returned. A single call. Clara hadn't answered any of her texts. And Margaret? Margaret had been unusually attentive today, but it wasn't care. It was observation, a subtle monitoring of every movement, every reaction, every thought that Emily hadn't even spoken aloud. Emily leaned back, eyes fixed on the muted light of the living room, heart pounding. The dread that had been creeping through the house since morning had grown into a tangible weight. She whispered to Max, "Something isn't right. I just know it." The dog's ears pricked, his low growl rumbling like a distant warning. Outside, the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the house in dim twilight. Emily's pulse quickened as the day's uneasy quiet settled fully, wrapping the room in tension. Something was coming, something she could not yet see, and she knew with a cold certainty that the missing calls were only the first sign. The quiet shattered in an instant. Emily's body lay sprawled on the polished hardwood floor of the living room, a deep crimson stain spreading beneath her. Max barked frantically, lunging toward the intruding shadow in the room, fur bristling and teeth bared. His frantic growls echoed off the walls as he circled Emily, unwilling to leave her side. The sunlight had dimmed into a muted gray haze, making the blood stark, almost surreal against the pale wood. Mark's arrival in the doorway was sudden, breathless, panic flooding his features. "Emily!" His voice cracked as he fell to his knees beside her, hands hovering uncertainly over her body. His mind struggled to reconcile the image before him with the woman he had kissed that morning, the woman who had smiled faintly, sitting on that same sofa just hours ago. Margaret stood near the hallway, pale but composed, her eyes fixed on Emily's body. She didn't move, didn't speak, as though frozen in shock or perhaps in calculation. Max barked again, leaping toward her, snarling, fur bristling in a warning that made Emily's skin crawl even in her unconscious, or worse, lifeless state. Mark swatted the dog gently, murmuring words of reassurance he didn't feel, and glanced at Margaret. Her thin, controlled smile remained, unreadable, her presence both comforting and terrifying all at once. Mark's fingers searched for a pulse he already feared he wouldn't find. There was none. His chest tightened, tears welling in his eyes, a strangled gasp escaping his throat. No, Emily. The words broke into sobs that seemed to fill the entire house. Max whimpered, pressed against her lifeless form, protective to the end, unwilling to leave her side. Margaret's voice finally cut through the tense air, calm yet chilling. "You should call the authorities," she said softly, almost too softly, as if suggesting an inevitable step rather than expressing concern. Mark's gaze shot to her, wide and questioning, but she met his stare evenly, unflinching, a mask of civility that felt impossibly cold. Mark's hands shook as he picked up the phone, dialing the emergency number with unsteady fingers. Each ring felt endless, the silence between tone and response heavy and suffocating. Max refused to leave Emily, growling at every creak in the house, every shadow that shifted in the fading light. Margaret simply watched, almost detached, her expression unreadable. The paramedics arrived within minutes that seemed like hours. Their movements were clinical, efficient, but every motion underscored the reality Mark had been trying to avoid. Emily's body was gently moved, the spreading blood contained, photographs taken for evidence, and Mark followed each step numbly. Max circled the medics, growling when anyone came too close, refusing to leave the body of the woman he had instinctively known was in danger. The detectives arrived shortly after, their presence formal yet heavy with the weight of investigation. Questions were asked, whispered, and scribbled down on notepads. Margaret offered her account with unnerving composure, careful. Her explanations were precise, measured, yet something about the way she avoided Mark's eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders, spoke louder than the words themselves. Detective Ramirez crouched beside Max, speaking softly to the dog, who seemed almost to understand. Max barked once, short, sharp, and directed toward the hallway where Margaret had been standing moments ago. Ramirez noted the behavior carefully, a subtle clue that perhaps the dog had witnessed something significant. Mark, crumpled in a corner of the living room, felt a cold emptiness creep over him. He stared at the pool of red that had once been Emily, the life he had shared, the love that had grown between them, now brutally interrupted. The realization sank like lead in his chest. Nothing in this house would ever feel the same. Outside, the day had waned into dusk. Shadows now stretched long and dark across the Harper home. The serenity of the morning, the ordinary rhythms of their lives, had been obliterated by a single violent act. Max barked again, low and warning, a reminder that the danger had not yet fully passed. Detective Ramirez looked around the room, eyes narrowing, taking in the scene, the position of the body, the reactions of the witnesses, and the restless dog. "We need to secure the house," he said firmly. "Every detail matters." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and somewhere beneath it all, unspoken but undeniable, lingered the question that would drive the investigation forward. Who could do this, and why? The Harper house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Detectives moved through each room with methodical precision, noting every detail: the faint smudges on the walls, the overturned vase in the hallway, the lingering scent of tea in the kitchen. Shadows from the late afternoon sun stretched across the furniture, deepening the sense of unease that had taken root since Emily's death. Max paced anxiously, tail low, occasionally letting out a sharp bark at corners that seemed to hold invisible threats. Detective Ramirez crouched beside the dog, speaking softly. "Easy, boy, we just need your help." Max's ears twitched, his gaze flicking toward the hallway where Margaret had stood during the attack. Ramirez's partner, Detective Alvarez, knelt to examine the floor near Emily's resting place, tracing the patterns of blood spatters with careful attention. Each small detail told a story, one they would need to piece together to uncover the truth. Mark hovered near the doorway, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. He barely noticed Margaret, who sat stiffly in the living room armchair, hands clasped neatly in her lap. She offered no comfort, no expression, beyond a careful composure that unnerved everyone in the room. Ramirez's eyes flicked to her repeatedly, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the controlled rhythm of her breathing. Something about her calmness didn't sit right. Interviews began with neighbors, a process both tedious and revealing. One neighbor mentioned seeing Margaret lingering outside earlier in the week, seemingly observing the house with unusual interest. Another recalled hearing an argument between Emily and Margaret over a trivial matter days before the incident. Each piece of information, though small, contributed to a growing picture of the household as one filled with hidden conflicts and unspoken resentments. Inside, the detectives discovered fragments of a more private life, journals Emily had kept, her handwriting sometimes neat, sometimes rushed, hinting at growing anxiety. Entries mentioned tension with Margaret, feelings of isolation despite Mark's outward support, and a persistent unease that something was wrong in the home. Ramirez read a passage aloud quietly, allowing Alvarez and Mark to hear. "I don't know how long I can keep pretending everything is normal. I feel watched, judged, and trapped. Max seems to know something I can't see." Words hung in the air, chilling and prescient. Margaret's eyes flicked up briefly, then returned to her hands. She said nothing, though her silence spoke volumes. Ramirez noted the incongruity, the meticulous composure paired with an undercurrent of something darker, an energy that seemed to ripple beneath the surface. He made a mental note. Every interaction, every unspoken glance would need to be scrutinized. Mark followed the detectives through the house, each room a painful reminder of what had been lost. Photographs of Emily and her growing belly were carefully lifted and cataloged by the forensic team, their presence a stark contrast to the blood-stained floor that had become the center of this tragedy. Every detail mattered: small gestures, overlooked habits, the positioning of furniture, all clues to the dynamics within these walls. Max returned to Emily's bedroom, pawing gently at the blankets she had left behind. Ramirez crouched beside him again, noting the dog's reaction to certain areas of the house. Each growl, each lingering glance hinted at what human witnesses might have missed. The house itself seemed alive with secrets, whispered in creaks and shadows, in the subtle behaviors of its inhabitants and its only loyal observer. As the evening deepened, Ramirez gathered the small team in the living room. "This isn't just a murder scene," he said quietly. "It's a house full of hidden tensions, motives, and betrayals. If we want answers, we need to understand every secret, every relationship." Mark nodded numbly, eyes fixed on the floor. Margaret remained seated, serene yet unreadable, a silent challenge in her calm gaze. And somewhere in the shadows, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next revelation to emerge, the next truth to unravel, as the investigation began to pierce its carefully constructed facade. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast a harsh glare on Margaret Harper's composed face. Detective Ramirez watched her carefully, noting the almost imperceptible twitch of her fingers and the faint narrowing of her eyes whenever Mark's name was mentioned. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly on the table, a model of calm, though Ramirez suspected it was a careful facade, hiding motives she would soon have to reveal. Mark Harper entered reluctantly, his hands trembling slightly. He looked exhausted, grief etched deeply into his features. "I don't understand how this happened," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Ramirez gestured for him to take a seat, and Mark complied, though he kept glancing at Margaret, confusion and suspicion mingling in his gaze. Margaret's voice was soft, almost delicate, yet carried a precision that made every word calculated. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she replied when questioned about her whereabouts during the morning. "I was here, as always. I had nothing to do with this tragedy." Her tone was measured, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the door, as if anticipating something, or someone, that could validate her story. Ramirez leaned forward, placing a photograph of the crime scene on the table. Emily's lifeless form stared back, haunting in its stillness. "Margaret, the timeline isn't adding up. Witnesses saw you near the living room at odd intervals. Can you explain why Max was barking at you so aggressively?" A flicker of irritation crossed her face, quickly replaced by an even, controlled mask. "Max?" she said lightly, almost laughing. "He's an overprotective dog. You know how they are. I have no idea why he would react in such a way." Her answer was technically true, but the subtle defensiveness betrayed her. Ramirez noted it. Dogs didn't bark without reason, and Max's reaction had been visceral, instinctual. Mark's voice trembled as he spoke for the first time. "Margaret, Emily trusted you. She considered you family. I can't believe you." His sentence broke, the weight of grief choking him. Margaret's lips pressed together, a thin line of suppressed emotion. She didn't flinch, didn't respond, leaving the accusation suspended in the air. The detectives continued with their questions, alternating between calm and pointed, watching for reactions. Margaret's answers were precise, rehearsed, and always just enough to appear cooperative while revealing nothing truly incriminating. Every time the discussion touched on Emily's fears, her journals, or her unease around Margaret, the woman's gaze flicked briefly downward, her fingers tightening on the table, betraying a momentary crack in the facade. Ramirez paused, allowing silence to fill the room. Silence was often more revealing than words. He watched Margaret carefully. Every pause, every shift in posture, every blink carried weight. "We know about the arguments," he said softly, "the tension in this house, the resentment Emily wrote about in her journal. You can deny it all you want, but hiding the truth won't help anyone." Margaret's hands trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I never wanted this," she murmured, her voice low. "You don't understand. She had no idea." Ramirez leaned in, sensing the subtle confession beneath the careful words. Mark looked between them, eyes wide, not fully understanding the complex web of tension, jealousy, and control that had threaded through the Harper home. His grief mingled with confusion and suspicion, and he struggled to process the fragments of information unfolding in front of him. Max, waiting quietly outside the room with an officer, let out a soft, warning growl, as though sensing the unspoken truths being revealed. Every instinct, every subtle reaction seemed to point toward a deeper, darker story buried beneath polite smiles and carefully constructed lies. The interrogation ended for the day, but the detectives left with a clear sense. Margaret Harper's calm exterior was a veneer. Behind it lay resentment, manipulation, and motives tangled with conspiracy, jealousy, and control. Every answer given, every omission noted, was a step closer to unraveling the carefully maintained facade. And as Mark walked away, exhausted and broken, Ramirez knew the next session would force Margaret to confront her own darkness, revealing the truth that had remained hidden in the shadows of the Harper household. The Harper home was quiet, almost eerily so, as forensic teams returned to comb through every corner for overlooked clues. Detective Ramirez moved methodically, notebook in hand, noting the smallest anomalies: a faint fingerprint smudge on the kitchen counter, a slightly ajar cabinet door, and a subtle streak of dirt near the hallway rug. Max padded alongside him, nose twitching, tail low, scanning every surface as though he could sense what human eyes might miss. Alvarez knelt near the living room, carefully photographing the scene where Emily had been found. "There's more here than we initially thought," he said quietly. Ramirez nodded, eyes fixed on the edges of the bloodstain, now cleaned but still marked by faint traces. "Every detail tells a story," he murmured. "We just have to read it correctly." Margaret Harper moved silently through the home, observing with an almost predatory composure. She smiled faintly at the detectives, polite but calculated, yet Ramirez noticed a tension in her shoulders. The calm exterior she presented during interrogations had not faltered completely, but subtle signs, tightening jaw, shallow breaths, hinted at a deeper unease. Something she had hoped to keep hidden was beginning to surface. The team discovered small overlooked items: a half-empty bottle of prescription pills tucked behind a stack of books, and a cup with faint residue that lab tests later confirmed contained a trace of a sedative. The handwriting on a note, partially hidden beneath the couch, suggested Emily had suspected someone close to her was not entirely trustworthy. Ramirez read the note aloud softly. "I can't trust anyone. Here, I feel watched. Max senses it too." The words seemed to hang in the air, a chilling echo of Emily's growing fear. Max growled softly, approaching the hallway where Margaret had lingered earlier. The dog's gaze fixed on a small stain near the baseboard, barely noticeable. Ramirez crouched beside him, examining the spot closely. The trace evidence suggested contact that had previously gone unnoticed: footprints smeared with dirt and faint traces of residue that hinted at tampering. It was subtle but significant, a clue that linked Margaret to areas of the house she had claimed never to enter. Mark hovered nearby, pale and uncertain, his hands shaking as he observed the discoveries. Could she have done this?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Ramirez gave a measured nod, though he remained cautious. Evidence alone rarely told the full story, but these fragments, combined with Max's instincts, Margaret's inconsistent statements, and the patterns emerging from Emily's journals, painted a troubling picture. The forensic team also noted inconsistencies in Margaret's account of her movements that morning. Timelines clashed. Minor contradictions in seemingly trivial details became glaring under scrutiny, and the trace evidence began to build a case around her presence in critical areas of the house. Ramirez scribbled notes feverishly, aware that each piece of evidence, however small, could be pivotal in the investigation. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the Harper home, deepening the sense of foreboding. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of air through the blinds seemed amplified in the quiet, a reminder that the house held more secrets than anyone could imagine. Ramirez looked at Margaret, seated in the armchair, serene but watchful, and realized that the hidden evidence was only the beginning. Max nudged a small folded envelope near the base of the couch. Ramirez picked it up, carefully opening it. Inside were receipts, notes, and fragments of messages Emily had kept, documenting her suspicions, her fears, and the unease that had grown into dread. Each document painted a picture of tension, manipulation, and an invisible hand guiding events in the Harper household. Ramirez exhaled slowly. "This isn't just circumstantial," he said quietly. "The truth is here, hidden in plain sight. We just need to piece it together correctly." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the house in dim twilight. The hidden evidence, once overlooked, had begun to illuminate the web of secrets, lies, and manipulation that had culminated in Emily's death. And as the detectives prepared for the next stage of questioning, the house seemed to whisper its truths, ready to reveal everything. The dim light of the interrogation room cast long, angular shadows across the walls. Margaret Harper sat in her usual posture, back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on a distant point just beyond the table. Detective Ramirez watched her quietly, notebook open but untouched for the moment, waiting for the precise moment when her composure might falter. Max lay outside the room, alert but restrained, as if sensing the tension within. Margaret's voice broke the silence first, soft and almost casual. "I've told you everything," she said. Her tone was even, precise, yet there was a subtle tremor, so faint it could have been dismissed, but Ramirez noted it immediately. There was a story she wasn't telling, and the careful mask of control was beginning to crack. Ramirez leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Margaret, the evidence is clear. The hidden notes, the traces of sedative, Max's reaction, your inconsistent timeline. It all points to something you've been trying to hide. You don't need to protect yourself anymore. Just tell us what happened." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing, lips pressed tightly together. Then her eyes flicked to Mark, seated nearby, grief etched across his face. The sight of him seemed to weigh on her, and for the first time, her carefully constructed calm wavered. Ramirez sensed it instantly. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered finally, voice low, almost strangled. "It was supposed to be temporary, harmless, just a small push, a way to make her comply, to get her to listen. But she didn't." Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and the room seemed to contract around the confession, shadows deepening with each word. Mark's eyes widened, disbelief written across his features. "Margaret, what are you saying?" His voice cracked, desperate and confused, struggling to reconcile the woman he had known with the actions she had just implied. Margaret's gaze shifted downward, focusing on the table. "I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand, to obey. I thought I was helping. But she resisted. She always resisted. I never—" Her voice faltered, tears welling in the corners of her eyes. The mask had fallen. Fallen entirely now, leaving raw, unfiltered emotion exposed. Ramirez scribbled notes quickly, careful to capture every nuance. "What do you mean by make her obey? What did you do?" Margaret exhaled shakily. "I gave her the sedative, just enough to make her sleepy, to calm her nerves. I didn't know she would slip. I didn't mean for her to fall, to die." Her words tumbled out, halting and frantic, a mixture of guilt and fear. The confession hung in the room, heavy as the shadows that stretched across the walls. Max barked once, sharply, outside the room, as though sensing the truth being revealed. His instincts had been right all along, warning them that something was amiss, that someone close had crossed a line, invisible to the human eye until now. Mark sat frozen, staring at Margaret, grappling with a storm of emotions. Anger, grief, disbelief, and sorrow, intertwined in a knot that refused to loosen. You killed her," he whispered, voice trembling. "You killed Emily." Margaret lowered her gaze, tears streaming freely now. "I didn't mean to. I loved her, in my way. I thought controlling her, protecting her, would save her. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." The room seemed to absorb her confession, the shadows deepening as the truth settled over everyone present like a suffocating weight. Ramirez closed his notebook and exhaled slowly. "It's over now. We know what happened. The evidence matches your account, and we will proceed accordingly. His voice was calm, procedural, yet under it was the unspoken gravity of betrayal, secrecy, and the cost of manipulation. Outside, Max pressed his nose against the glass, eyes fixed on Margaret, tail low but alert. Even the dog seemed to recognize the finality of the confession, the culmination of instincts, observations, and warnings now validated. As Margaret was escorted from the room, the shadows clung to her retreating figure, lingering in the corners where the truth had finally emerged. Ramirez turned to Mark, whose grief had deepened into numb resignation. The web of deception and control that had enveloped the Harper household was unraveling, one confession at a time. And though the truth was out, the weight of what had happened, the manipulation, the betrayal, the loss, would linger far longer than the shadows of the room ever could. The courtroom was heavy with tension, a hushed anticipation settling over the rows of chairs as spectators whispered softly. Margaret Harper sat at the defendant's table, her once imposing composure now tempered by a quiet nervousness. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined, eyes fixed on the floor in front of her. Detective Ramirez and Alvarez observed from the back, aware that every subtle gesture, every fleeting glance could reveal truths beyond testimony. Mark Harper sat just a few rows away, his face pale and drawn, grief etched into the lines around his eyes. He held Max close, the dog's head resting on his lap, ears flicking attentively. At the faint murmurs that filled the room, the bond between man and dog, already profound in life, now served as an anchor against the waves of shock and sorrow that had overtaken him. The judge entered, gavel striking sharply, and the room stilled. The proceedings began with opening statements, the prosecutor outlining the case with clinical precision. On the morning of March 12th, the attorney began, voice steady, Emily Harper, 8 months pregnant, was found dead in her own home. Evidence collected from the scene, witness testimony, and forensic analysis all point to the actions of the defendant, Margaret Harper. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, like a shadow stretching across the room. Margaret's attorney rose in response, calm yet deliberate. The defense does not dispute the tragedy of Emily Harper's death, he said, but we will demonstrate that intent, premeditation, and culpability are far from clear in this case. Circumstances, emotional instability, and misjudgments must all be considered before rushing to judgment. His words were precise, measured, but Ramirez noted the subtle defensive tension in Margaret's posture, a lingering reminder of guilt beneath the surface. Testimonies began one by one, each building the narrative of fear, manipulation, and subtle control that had pervaded the Harper household. Detective Ramirez recounted the meticulous investigation, the hidden notes Emily had kept, Max's warning behavior, forensic traces of the sedative, and the timeline discrepancies in Margaret's statements. Each detail was presented carefully, cinematic in its clarity, leaving little room for doubt. Then came Emily's journals, read aloud in fragments by the prosecutor. The words revealed her growing dread, the tension between herself and Margaret, the sense of being watched, the protective instincts of Max, and the isolation she had felt despite Mark's love. The courtroom fell silent as the written voice of the deceased carried it through the air, raw and haunting, a ghostly echo of the truth that had been ignored for too long. Margaret's defense attorney attempted to challenge the timeline, the intentions, the interpretation of evidence, but each argument was met with corroboration, from forensic reports, witness accounts, and Max's documented reactions. The dog, present for much of the testimony, pawed at Mark's lap, alert to each sound, each movement, a living witness to both loyalty and tragedy. The prosecution rested, leaving Margaret herself to take the stand. Her confession, detailed during the interrogations, was recounted, her voice low and trembling, each word a testament to her guilt and remorse. She admitted the sedative, the misjudged control, the unintended consequences. The courtroom listened, wrapped in tense, as the human drama of fear, obsession, and error unfolded in stark, undeniable clarity. Closing arguments emphasized accountability, the consequences of manipulation, and the irrevocable cost of betrayal. The jury deliberated, faces tense, hands clasped tightly as they weighed every detail of testimony, evidence, and emotional resonance. Hours stretched, heavy and unbearable, until finally the foreperson rose, voice steady but grave. On the count of involuntary manslaughter and criminal negligence resulting in the death of Emily Harper, we find the defendant guilty. The words landed like a hammer, final and absolute. Mark's shoulders slumped, a mixture of relief, grief, and sorrow washing over him. Max barked softly, a quiet acknowledgement of the long-fought truth, as Margaret was escorted away, the shadow of her actions trailing behind her. The courtroom emptied slowly, each person carrying away fragments of shock, sadness, and reflection. Justice, while served in the formal sense, could not restore what had been lost. Mark left quietly, Max at his side, both aware that the echoes of betrayal, grief, and the fractured trust of family would linger far beyond the verdict. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps. Justice had been rendered, the truth revealed, but the human cost, love lost, innocence shattered, remained, indelibly etched into the Harper household, the lives of those who had loved Emily and the loyal dog who had been her first instinctive protector. The Harper home was quiet again, but it was a silence heavier than before. The echo of footsteps, laughter, and ordinary conversation had been replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to settle in every corner. Mark sat on the edge of the sofa, Max lying close to his feet, the dog's head resting gently on his owner's lap. The room felt both familiar and alien, a monument to the life that had been, now fractured beyond repair. Mark stared at the empty space where Emily had once rested, the couch cushions bearing faint impressions of her presence, the warmth of her life lingering like a ghost. He traced his fingers along the fabric, as if the touch could bring back even a fragment of her. Max nudged his hand gently, a soft whine accompanying the gesture, offering comfort in the silence that words could not fill. Days had passed since the trial, since Margaret had been led away, her composure stripped bare in court and replaced with consequences she could no longer evade. Justice had been served, at least legally, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. Mark had learned to navigate a world that now felt colder, the trust in family fractured, the sanctuary of home now a site of haunting memories. He had begun going through Emily's things, slowly, reverently. Her journals, photographs, and small keepsakes were now artifacts of a life that had ended too soon. Each item told a story, each page a memory, each photograph a moment frozen in time. Mark read passages aloud to himself, the words a lifeline connecting him to the woman he loved and the life they had built together. Max remained vigilant, ears pricked, alert to every creak and shift, as if guarding against any further betrayal. Evenings were the hardest. The house seemed to breathe with its own memories, shadows stretching across walls in familiar patterns that now felt alien. Mark would sit silently by the window, Max curled beside him, staring out at the street where Emily had once walked, where neighbors had waved, where life had carried on oblivious to the storm that had erupted within these walls. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a reminder of absence, a reflection of loss that could not be mended. Friends and neighbors had visited, offering condolences and support, but Mark often found himself retreating into the quiet, needing the presence of Max and the lingering essence of Emily to anchor him. He spoke little, choosing instead to honor her memory through small acts, watering the plants she loved, keeping the home tidy in the way she had, speaking softly to Max as they moved through the house together. At night, he would light a single candle in Emily's favorite corner, watching the flickering flame dance against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The light was fragile, yet comforting, a symbol of memory and enduring love. Max would lay at his feet, growling softly at shadows, ever protective, ever present, a living testament to loyalty and instinct. Mark began to write letters to Emily, words poured onto paper that would never be sent, confessions of grief, memories of love, promises to carry her spirit forward. Max's gentle nudges reminded him of presence and connection, a quiet companionship that filled the spaces Emily had left behind. Each word, each sigh, each silent vigil became part of a ritual, a way to keep her memory alive even as the world moved forward. In those quiet moments, Mark realized that life would never return to its former rhythm. The Harper home, scarred yet enduring, now held a different purpose, a place of remembrance, of loyalty, and of reflection. The silence was different. Not merely absence, it was witness. It was testament. It was a vigil for a love that had been lost but would never be forgotten. As night deepened, Mark closed his eyes, Max settling fully against him, warm and steady. Together, they held their vigil, silent yet full of emotion, the shadows around them echoing the life that had been, the truths that had been revealed, and the love that remained beyond the reach of grief. The Harper home had regained a quiet semblance of normalcy, though it was a fragile, almost deceptive piece. The cameras installed for security purposes remained active, their cold, unblinking lenses recording every movement, every shadow. Mark often checked the footage out of habit, a subtle attempt to reassure himself that no unseen danger lingered. Yet tonight, as the room dimmed with the fading light, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Small, fleeting moments that the cameras hadn't captured in their entirety. He rewound the footage to the morning before. Emily's death, scrutinizing every frame. A shadow moved at the edge of the lens in the living room, barely perceptible. It wasn't the angle of the camera, nor a trick of the light. It was deliberate. Margaret's movements, which had seemed innocuous, now appeared more calculated, more purposeful. She lingered longer than necessary in certain areas, her gestures precise, rehearsed, almost ritualistic. The camera hadn't shown the intent, the subtle expressions on her face, the quiet moments where she seemed to watch Emily, assessing and planning. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. Max, lying at his feet, lifted his head, ears alert, growling softly. The dog's instinct had been right all along. There had been a tension, a presence that cameras could not fully convey. Mark realized the security footage was incomplete. It could capture events, but not intent, not subtle cues, not the manipulation that had taken root in the Harper home long before tragedy struck. He reviewed the days after. Emily's death, the trial, and Margaret's confession, comparing the recordings to the evidence presented in court. Certain gestures, brief glances, the moments when she adjusted objects in the house, even small hesitations, all pointed to control and premeditation that had been invisible to most. The camera had captured action, but not the silent choreography of manipulation, the emotional tension that had driven Margaret's choices. Max nudged Mark's hand insistently, prompting him to focus on a corner of the living room where a small, overlooked bookshelf had once stood. The camera had recorded Margaret standing near it, yet it hadn't shown what she did, sliding a note, adjusting an object, leaving traces of her influence unnoticed. Ramirez's team had uncovered evidence, but the camera had only hinted at the subtle orchestration, the ways Margaret had manipulated her surroundings, maintained appearances, and controlled perception. Mark felt a mix of dread and understanding. He realized, now that the tragedy had been inevitable once the manipulations had begun, even if unintentional in part, cameras could record the physical, the visible, but they could not capture the psychological, the whispers, the looks, the silent pressure that had suffocated Emily's peace and, ultimately, her life. He closed the footage, sitting back, Max resting his head fully in Mark's lap. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the revelation. Margaret's influence had been deeper, more pervasive, more sinister than even the trial had revealed. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the full scope of the manipulation, the insidious emotional control, would never be fully recorded, never fully understood by those who had only glimpsed fragments of the Harper household's private world. Mark rose slowly, walking through the quiet house, noticing the faint traces of Emily's life, the blanket she had used, the small handprints on the windowsill, the scent of her favorite soap lingering in the bathroom. The camera had never captured these intimate, human moments. They existed only in memory, in the tactile world, in the emotions and instincts of those who had lived alongside her. He knelt by the sofa, tracing the fabric with his fingers, and whispered softly, "I see it now, Emily. I see everything you felt, everything you feared." Max pawed gently, a quiet affirmation of shared understanding, a companion through grief and revelation. Outside, the evening sky darkened, casting long shadows across the home. The cameras continued their silent vigil, recording light and movement, yet blind to the most profound truths, the emotional undercurrents, the manipulations, and the love that had existed beyond tragedy. Mark understood then that some things could never be captured on film. Some truths were felt, lived, and remembered. In the silence of the house, in the presence of Max, he held Emily's memory close, honoring the life she had lived, the love she had given, and the subtle, unseen moments that had shaped the tragedy. And in that quiet, he finally allowed himself a fragile sense of peace.